The rain was falling heavy that morning, turning the dirt road into a mess of mud that clung to shoes and wagon wheels alike. She pulled her shawl tighter around her thin frame, the fabric so worn it was more holes than thread. In her basket were 3 loaves of bread, baked at dawn from flour she had borrowed, promising to pay back with work she didn't yet have. The town looked at her with that same mixture of pity and disdain they always did. Poor was bad enough, but proud and poor was worse. She held her head high, though her stomach gnawed with hunger and her heart carried the weight of 1,000 whispered insults. Children snickered behind her, pointing at her patched dress. Women drew their skirts aside as if she carried filth. Men looked past her, as though she were nothing but air. Every step in that street reminded her she didn't belong, that poverty was louder than any voice she could muster. She walked on anyway, chin lifted, eyes fixed forward. She reached the general store to sell her bread, only to find Mrs. Tully waiting at the counter, lips pressed thin. "Not today," she said before the girl could speak. "Folks don't want charity disguised as bread. There's proper bakers in town." She laid down coins for sugar, never meeting the girl's gaze. The loaves in her basket seemed heavier with every heartbeat. She stepped outside, blinking against the wet air. That was when the laughter started. A group of women stood under the awning of the dress shop, watching her with sharp eyes. One of them whispered loud enough for all to hear, "Maybe she should sell her rags instead. At least then we'd know what we're buying." Another joined in, "Or herself. That's all she's got left to trade." Their laughter rang through the street, cruel and cutting. She didn't stop. She couldn't. If she let them see her cry, they would never let her forget it. She walked on, basket held tight, steps steady despite the ache in her chest. Then the horses came, hooves striking hard against the wet road, a wagon rolling in with polished wood and gleaming harnesses. The driver pulled the reins, and the man seated beside him stood tall, his hat broad-brimmed, his coat of fine leather, boots shining despite the mud. He was a baron by birth and land, wealth-ridden in every detail of his carriage, but his eyes weren't fixed on the street, nor on the shopfronts that bustled to greet him. His gaze found her, standing alone in the rain, holding a basket of bread no one would buy. The crowd hushed, watching. He stepped down from the wagon, boots sinking slightly in the mud, but he didn't mind. He walked toward her, his stride slow, deliberate, each step a choice. When he stopped before her, the whole street seemed to lean closer. His voice was low, but it carried, every word cutting through the silence like a blade. "My ranch," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "needs a woman like you." She stared at him, stunned, uncertain if he was mocking her as the others did. But there was no mockery in his tone, no cruelty in his eyes. Only steadiness, the kind that didn't waver when storms came. He reached for her basket, lifting it as though it weighed nothing, and took a loaf in his hand. He broke it in half, tasted it, then looked back at her. Bread baked with hands that know hunger tastes different than bread made for coin. "My men will eat no other, not if I can help it." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The women under the awning shifted uncomfortably, their laughter dead on their lips. The storekeeper stepped out, face pale, realizing too late what had just unfolded. The baron placed silver coins into her palm, more than she had ever held at once. Her fingers trembled, but he closed her hand gently around them. "Come by the ranch tomorrow," he said. "We'll talk about how a woman of your strength and pride might make it a home worth living in." And with that, he turned, tucking the loaf under his arm, walking back to his wagon as if nothing unusual had happened. But the street was no longer the same. No one laughed. No one dared. She stood frozen, rain soaking through her shawl, silver warm against her skin. For the first time in years, her chin lifted not out of defiance but out of hope. The same townsfolk who mocked her now shifted their eyes away, unable to meet her gaze. Something had shifted in the air, something she couldn't quite name yet. The poor girl they had scorned was no longer invisible. Someone had seen her worth, not hidden behind riches or fine clothes, but in the quiet dignity she carried despite it all. And that someone had power enough to make the whole town see her differently. Still clutching the coins, she walked forward, no longer weighed down by the bread in her basket, but lifted by the thought that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The rain had stopped by the time she reached the edge of town, though the mud clung to her hem and dragged with every step. The silver coins in her hand felt almost unreal, as if they would dissolve if she opened her palm too quickly. She tucked them deep into her dress pocket, her fingers brushing the lining again and again as if to make sure they were still there. Every glance from the townsfolk carried something new now, some wary, some jealous, others uncertain. Their eyes followed her until she was gone, but she no longer felt the sting of mockery. For once, she wasn't walking invisible. Her small cabin stood at the edge of the woods, half-collapsed roof patched with straw and tar, walls weathered gray with years of wind and rain. Inside was little more than a cot, a stove, and a table worn smooth by time. She set the basket down and lit the lamp, watching the flame flicker to life. The room felt less lonely tonight, less heavy. She laid the silver coins out carefully on the table, her breath catching at the sight of them. It was enough to buy food for weeks, maybe even a dress that wasn't stitched together from scraps. But more than the money, it was what he had said, the weight of his voice steady and sure, "My ranch needs a woman like you." She didn't sleep much that night. She lay awake listening to the wind tugging at the boards, her mind turning over the memory of his eyes, the way the whole town had gone quiet when he spoke. A baron, a man of wealth and power, had chosen to see her, who had been nothing but whispers and scorn to everyone else. When dawn came, she rose with the first light, braided her hair with care, and brushed out her dress until the fabric almost looked respectable. She carried the last loaf of bread in her basket, not as something to sell, but as something to offer. With each step down the dirt road toward his ranch, her heart beat harder, half with fear, half with hope. The ranch came into view just as the sun cleared the hills. Wide fields stretched out, dotted with grazing cattle, fences sturdy and well kept. Barns stood tall and painted, workers moving briskly between tasks. And at the heart of it all, the house rose, broad porches, windows gleaming, built from timber strong and proud. It was a different world from her cabin of creaking wood. The foreman at the gate raised his brow at her, clearly doubtful of her presence. But when she gave her name, his demeanor shifted, and he motioned her through. "He's expecting you," the man said, his tone almost surprised. She walked the gravel path, every step echoing louder in her ears. At the porch, he appeared, tall as she remembered, hat in his hand, his coat laid aside to reveal a shirt that clung to shoulders built from work, not just wealth. He smiled, not the polite curve of lips people offered out of courtesy, but a smile that reached his eyes, warm and steady. "You came," he said simply, as if he had known she would. She handed him the loaf of bread, her voice quiet. "I brought this, it's not much." He broke it, just as he had before, tasting it as though it were finer than any meal his cooks could prepare. "It's enough," he replied. "Come inside. We have much to talk about." The house was filled with light, the scent of wood polish and hearth smoke. The table was long, set with plates already waiting. He gestured for her to sit. Workers passed through with trays, but none questioned her presence, though their glances lingered with curiosity. He asked her about her life, not in the idle way townsfolk asked only to judge, but with genuine interest. She told him of her father, who had died when she was small, of her mother who had worked herself sick to keep them alive, and of the years after, when she had been left with nothing but her hands and her pride. She spoke carefully, wary of saying too much, but he listened to every word as though it mattered. "You've survived more than most could bear," he said at last. "That strength is worth more than coin. I can give you work here, steady work, honest pay. My ranch needs someone who knows how to stretch little into enough. My men eat, but they don't eat well. A woman like you could change that." Her throat tightened. Work meant dignity. Work meant no longer standing in the street, begging people to buy what they would rather mock. She nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "If you'll have me, I'll work until my hands bleed." He smiled again, softer this time. "I don't doubt that." So it began. Her days filled with the rhythm of the ranch, the clatter of pots, the scent of rising bread, the sizzle of meat on the stove. The men came in dusty and hungry, and at first, they eyed her with doubt. But when they tasted her food, their faces shifted. She saw it in the way they cleaned their plates, in the way they came back with gratitude instead of grumbling. Word spread quickly. The kitchen became the heart of the ranch, and she, who had once been invisible, was now the one they all relied upon. But it wasn't only the kitchen that changed. The house itself took on a warmth it hadn't known. She mended curtains, scrubbed floors, filled vases with wildflowers she gathered on her way to the stream. Where once the grand house had felt more like a monument, it now began to feel like a home. And always, he was there. Sometimes he came to the kitchen, leaning against the doorway as she worked, telling stories of the cattle drive or listening as she spoke of small things. Other times, she saw him outside, sleeves rolled, working alongside his men, not too proud to sweat beside them. She learned his name, his history, the loss of a wife long ago that had left his home empty. He did not speak of it often, but she could see it in the shadows of his eyes. The town did not ignore her anymore. Women who once mocked her now greeted her with forced smiles. Men who had looked past her now tipped their hats. The same mouths that had called her worthless now whispered of her fortune. But she did not forget the sting of their cruelty. She walked through town not with bitterness, but with a strength that no one could take from her. The ranch grew under her care. She kept ledgers of supplies, planned meals that stretched through long winters, and even taught the children of workers their letters in the evenings. The men began to call her the heart of the ranch, and even the Baron himself echoed the words. And slowly, a bond grew between them, not built on riches or power, but on the quiet rhythm of shared days. She caught his gaze at the table when he thought she wasn't looking, a warmth there that spoke of more than gratitude. She felt it in the way his hand lingered when passing her a dish, in the steady calm of his voice when he asked if she was well. Yet doubt lingered in her heart. She was poor, a woman of patched dresses and empty cupboards. He was rich, with land and power enough to silence an entire town. She feared that what had drawn him was pity, or perhaps novelty, not the woman she truly was. But one evening, as the sun bled gold over the hills and she stood on the porch watching the cattle drift like shadows across the fields, he came to stand beside her. His silence stretched, comfortable and sure. At last, he spoke. "When I said my ranch needed a woman like you, I didn't mean only for the work you could do. I meant for the life you could bring into it." She turned, heart pounding, the words catching in her throat. But his eyes told her the truth of it, steady, unwavering, the same as they had been that day in the rain. The silver she had once clutched so tightly no longer mattered. The laughter of the town no longer echoed in her ears. What mattered was this, being seen, truly seen, for the first time. And in that moment, she knew that everything she had endured had led her here, not to riches, not to power, but to a place where her worth was no longer measured by what she lacked, but by the strength she carried within her. Life at the ranch did not remain a quiet dream. For every day that warmed her heart with belonging, there came another that tested the strength she thought she had already proven. Work on the land was never easy, and though she found comfort in the rhythm of the kitchen, her place in the Baron's household made her a target for whispers that did not die away, only grew sharper with time. At first, the townsfolk could not believe it. That the poor girl who once sold bread no one would buy now lived under the roof of the richest man for miles. They muttered that she must have bewitched him, that she must have tricked him with tears and false humility. And when those words did not wound her, they grew crueler, muttering about her patched dresses, about how a woman with nothing could only want his wealth. She ignored them, holding her head high as she always had. But at night, in the quiet of her small room at the ranch, their words pressed in. She wondered if the Baron heard them too. She wondered if they might poison his view of her, if the very people who had scorned her all her life might finally strip away the fragile hope she had built. The ranch itself was not without its troubles. That summer brought a storm that rolled in from the west, black clouds swallowing the horizon, winds tearing at fences and barns. The cattle panicked, breaking through the lower pastures, scattering across the open fields. Men scrambled in the rain, shouting over thunder, mud sucking at their boots. She stood at the porch at first, her heart in her throat, watching the chaos unfold. Then, without thought, she grabbed lanterns, ropes, blankets, running into the storm to bring what she could. The men looked at her with surprise when she appeared at their side, rain plastering her hair to her face, hands steady as she lit their way through the darkness. She tied ropes with quick fingers, soothed the skittish horses, wrapped wounded men in blankets and guided them back to safety. No one mocked her then. They worked beside her until dawn, mud to their knees, breath raw in their lungs. By morning, the ranch was battered, but it stood. The Baron found her in the barn, sitting on a hay bale, her hands torn and bleeding, her dress soaked through with rain and mud. He knelt before her, taking her hands gently in his. His eyes burned not with pity but with something deeper, pride, and a fierce admiration that made her chest ache. "You're more than I ever imagined," he said quietly. "This place, these people, Me, we're stronger because of you. She wanted to speak, but her throat closed. Instead, she looked at him, and in that gaze, words were not needed. But storms were not the only trials. The more she became part of the ranch, the clearer it became that others resented her place there. The foreman's wife, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, took every chance to remind her of her beginnings. Don't think hard work makes you his equal, she sneered one afternoon, while the girl hung laundry under the hot sun. A baron may feed on bread today, but tomorrow he'll want finer meals, and finer women. The words cut, but she did not reply. She folded the sheets, lifted her chin, and walked away. Yet the seed of doubt took root. Was she merely filling a gap, a temporary comfort until he sought someone of his own world? She had seen the women in town, dressed in silks, their hands uncalloused, their laughter light and practiced. How could she, in her patched dress and scarred hands, ever stand beside them? Still, the Baron gave her no reason to fear. He included her in decisions about the household, asked her opinions on matters she thought too small to matter to him but which he valued. He walked the fields with her, showing her the land, the hills, the river that cut through the pasture, as if sharing with her the very heart of who he was. And when the nights grew cold, and she lit fires in the hearth, he lingered in the doorway longer each time, his gaze steady, his silence heavy with words he had not yet spoken. One autumn evening, as golden leaves scattered across the porch, he invited her to ride with him to town. She hesitated, knowing the whispers would be waiting, but his hand extended toward her left no room for refusal. Walk beside me, he said. Let them see. The town fell silent when they arrived. He helped her down from the carriage, his hand firm at her waist, his gaze daring anyone to speak. The shopkeepers who once refused her bread now scrambled to greet her with false smiles. Women who had mocked her dresses now feigned admiration, their eyes flickering with envy. Children who once pointed now stared wide-eyed, hushed by the sight of the Baron's favor. But even amidst the silence, the cruelty found its way through. A man muttered too loudly, "He's gone soft," throwing his fortune at a beggar girl. Laughter followed from another corner. She froze, her cheeks burning, shame threatening to drag her back to the shadows. But before she could move, the Baron turned sharply, his voice cold as steel. "This woman has more worth than any coin in my pocket," he said, his words cutting through the crowd. "She has faced storms with courage, hunger with dignity, and cruelty with strength. If any man here thinks himself better, let him prove it, not with his tongue, but with his deeds." Silence fell like a hammer. No one answered. The man who had laughed dropped his gaze to the ground, his face pale. The Baron took her hand and led her into the shop as if nothing had been said, but she felt the shift in the air. The town could no longer mock her openly. The days stretched into months, each one binding her closer to the ranch and to him. She grew into her place, no longer the poor girl with patched dresses, but the woman whose presence steadied an entire household. Yet still she carried the scars of her past, the nights of hunger, the loneliness of being unseen, the sting of every whispered insult. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and the fields slept under the moon, she wondered if those scars would ever fade. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered outside. The stars stretched endless above her, cold and bright. She wrapped her shawl tight and sat on the porch steps, her thoughts heavy. She did not hear him approach until his shadow fell across her. "Why are you awake?" he asked softly, settling beside her. "I keep thinking of who I was," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of how they saw me. A beggar. A burden. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be more than that, no matter what I do here." He turned to her, his expression fierce. "You already are more. To them, to me, to this land. You've given life where there was none, hope where there was despair. Don't let the ghosts of their cruelty steal what you've built." Her eyes burned with tears she had held back for too long. "Why me?" she asked. Don't let the ghosts of their cruelty steal what you've built." Her eyes burned with tears she had held back for too long. "Why me?" she asked. "Out of all the women you could have chosen, why did you stop in the street that day?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then he said, "Because you didn't bow your head when they mocked you. You stood in the rain with nothing but a basket of bread, and you carried yourself like a queen. I saw the strength I needed, the strength this ranch needed, in you. And I've never doubted it since." The words sank into her like a balm on old wounds. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe them fully. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her, steady and sure. Seasons passed. Winters brought snow that blanketed the fields, springs brought floods that threatened the lower pastures, summers brought drought that cracked the earth. Through it all, she remained. She cooked, she planned, she fought alongside the men, she soothed the sick, she steadied the weary. Her hands grew rougher, her back stronger, but her heart also grew, filled with a warmth she had never known, a belonging that healed even the deepest scars. And through it all, the Baron stood with her. Not above her, not beyond her, but beside her. The town eventually learned to hold its tongue, for there was no denying what she had become. Not a beggar, not a burden, but the woman who had turned a house into a home, who had given a ranch its heart. And though she would always carry the memory of the girl who stood alone in the rain, mocked and unseen, she no longer carried it as a weight. She carried it as a reminder of how far she had come, and of the truth that had been spoken to her that day, that her worth was never measured by what she lacked, but by the strength she had carried all along. The seasons turned again, and with each passing year the ranch grew not just in strength but in spirit. What once had been a place of labor alone had become a living home, with laughter drifting from the kitchen and warmth in the rooms where silence had once lingered. Children played in the yard, workers gathered around the long table after days of toil, and stories were shared until the fire burned low. At the heart of it all was the woman who had once been mocked for being poor, the girl with a basket of bread no one wanted, now woven so deeply into the ranch's life that no one could imagine it without her. But change always brought trials. The Baron's wealth, his influence, and now his open devotion to her stirred not only whispers but envy. A neighboring landowner, a man bitter and ambitious, had long sought to claim the Baron's ranch for himself. He saw her as the weak link, the poor girl elevated beyond her station, and he believed that breaking her spirit would weaken the man who loved her. His words poisoned the ears of townsfolk once more, feeding their old prejudices, until rumors began again, sharper than before. She heard them when she went to town. That she was a burden, a fraud, a woman who had ensnared a good man only to live off his fortune. That the ranch had flourished not because of her, but in spite of her. Some even whispered that she had cursed the land, that the storms and droughts came as punishment for his folly in raising her so high. The words struck her harder than she cared to admit. No matter how far she had come, the memory of her hunger and shame clung to her like shadows. At night she lay awake, wondering if perhaps they were right, if perhaps her worth was no more than scraps of bread and stubborn pride. But every morning, when she rose to begin her work, she found strength again in the rhythm of her tasks, in the eyes of the workers who trusted her, and most of all, in the steady presence of the man who had seen her when no one else did. The Baron noticed her weariness, though she tried to hide it. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the fields gold, he found her sitting alone on the porch, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. He sat beside her in silence, and for a long time they watched the cattle drift like shadows across the pasture. At last, he spoke. "You've been carrying their words again," he said softly. Her hands tightened in her lap. "They'll never let me forget what I was. No matter what I do, I'll always be the poor girl who had nothing." He turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "You're not what they say. You never were. You were never nothing. You are the strongest woman I've ever known, and you've built more with your hands and your heart than they ever could with all their coin. This ranch stands because of you. I stand because of you. Let them talk. Their words are wind. What you've made here is stone." His voice broke through the walls she had built, and for the first time, she allowed herself to cry without shame. He pulled her close, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. And in that embrace, the whispers lost their power. But strength is tested not in words, but in fire. That winter, disaster struck. A sickness swept through the cattle, swift and merciless. Men worked day and night to save what they could, but the losses mounted. The ranch, once thriving, stood on the edge of ruin. The workers grew restless, fear gnawing at them. Some whispered that it was a curse, others that the Baron's fortune had finally turned. She refused to let despair take root. She rose before dawn each day, preparing food for the men, tending to the sick animals, keeping the books late into the night to stretch every supply. Her hands blistered, her body ached, but she never stopped. When the workers faltered, she steadied them with words of hope. When the Baron's shoulders bent under the weight of it all, she stood beside him, unshaken. One night, when the sickness had claimed nearly a third of the herd, the Baron sat at the table, his head in his hands. "I don't know if we can come back from this," he admitted, his voice heavy with despair. She placed her hand over his. "You've come back from worse. And if you can't see the way, then let me. We'll rebuild, one day at a time. We've weathered storms, droughts, and scorn. We'll weather this too, together." Her certainty lit a fire in him, and in the days that followed, they fought harder than ever. They cut costs, repaired fences, sold what they must, and little by little, the ranch began to steady again. It was not easy, and it was not quick, but their strength carried them through. The neighboring landowner who had spread poison in the town came forward then, offering to buy the ranch for a fraction of its worth, smug in his belief that they would be desperate enough to sell. The Baron nearly refused him with anger, but she stopped him, her eyes calm. "Let him think we are broken," she whispered. "There is no shame in being poor, but there is shame in surrendering what we have built. He will not win." And he did not. The ranch held, and as the sickness passed and the herd began to grow again, the man's schemes fell to dust. The town saw his spite for what it was, and the whispers against her grew quieter until they vanished altogether. Years passed. Children who had been born on the ranch grew strong, calling her Mama, though they were not her own. Workers who had once been strangers became family. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with laughter and song. And through it all, she and the Baron walked side by side, their bond unshaken by time or trial. There were still moments when she remembered the girl she had been, standing in the rain with a basket of bread no one would buy, mocked and scorned, unseen by the world. But now, when she thought of that girl, it was not with shame, but with pride. That girl had endured hunger, cruelty, and loneliness, and had stood unbroken. That girl had carried within her the strength to become the woman she was now. And in the evenings, when the day's work was done and the stars spread endless across the sky, she sat with the Baron on the porch, their hands entwined, their hearts at peace. He would sometimes turn to her, his eyes filled with the same steady warmth they had held the day he first spoke to her, and he would say, "My ranch needed a woman like you. I needed you." And she knew, with a certainty that no whispers could ever shake, that she had not only found a place in his home, but in his heart. The poor girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had carved her worth into the very soil beneath her feet, a woman who had turned mockery into strength, and sorrow into love. And though the world might still measure wealth in coin, she had learned the truth, that the richest life is built not with gold, but with courage, dignity, and a love that endures every storm.